the first thing that I have to do is I have to credit a text that I read this week in preparation for this message, Disrupting White Supremacy from Within. And it's a collection of essays in a hard copy book. That's Disrupting White Supremacy from Within. And the essay that I'm going to be referencing most often is titled To Hear and Be Accountable, An Ethic of White Listening by Anya Marie Vigan. So decentering white voices means acknowledging that white perspective completely dominates every aspect of our culture. White people, particularly white, cis, straight men, are considered to be the standard norm, the model through which all culture is shaped and designed by and for white people. All of our culture comes from the locus and the perspective of whiteness. And so some of our first work, especially as white people, when we're considering how to decenter this, is an understanding that it is entirely enculturated and socialized. It leaks into every aspect of our interaction. And we don't notice this because we are white people, and the culture was designed for and by us. So the first thing that you really have to do is swallow that red pill and wake up to the reality that American culture is inherently white. I have a quote here from Richard Delgado, who writes, "America is inherently a white country in character, in structure, in culture. Needless to say, Black Americans create lives of their own. Yet as a people, they face boundaries and constrictions set by the white majority. America's version of apartheid, while lacking overt legal sanction, comes closest to the system even now, reformed in the land of its invention." And so people of color, and we're talking specifically about Black people this morning, exist and are marooned and gate-kept outside of white dominant societal construction. Black people and people of color are further isolated by their experiences in a racist world, and further isolated because white people assume they know and understand the perspectives of their Black counterparts. We often dismiss the life experiences of Black people before we've even taken a moment to listen, because of all of the assumptions and the cultural baggage that white people carry with us through the world. So the first thing that we have to do is accept the reality that white perspective is a dominant and socialized perspective. The question becomes, how do we as individuals and as a collective disrupt and recenter so that we can create a more equitable and accessible future for all of us? And when I say we can create, I don't mean white people. I mean, how can we as humankind, in the rich and diverse tapestry that is the world, how can we together create a more equitable and accessible future for all of us? Vigan believes, and I'm referencing the essay, that we, white people, have three basic tasks that we must accomplish in our decentering work. The first, we must listen fully to the truths of communities of color who have suffered so long and so pervasively from white supremacy. Make no assumptions. Do not assume you have the solution. Do not write a person's experience before they write it themselves. Assumptions are something that we carry into every interaction that we have. And there's a lot of research, and Vigan writes extensively about this, about when Black and white communities come together in an attempt to dialogue, white folks listening to Black folks often come in with that narrative already filled in their head. So if we go into these interactions, if we approach people of color with even an unaware, subliminal, a subconscious belief that we know what they're going to say, we've already cut off the interaction. We have already failed at decentering our own perspective in sacrifice of having to listen to another's perspective. The second task that Vigan writes is, how do we resist our tendency to co-opt or translate or diminish or excuse that which people of color tell us about their experiences? We tend to, and there's all sorts of hard research that shows us this, even when white people are successful in decentering their perspective and putting aside their assumptions about what people of color are going to tell us about their experiences in the world, we tend to then take what we have learned, take what we have been told, and co-opt it for our own purposes. We turn it into something else. We reshape it so that it fits our assumptions and it fits what we have already determined to be the solution to whatever problem we are encountering about the existence of people of color. This third basic task is, how might our ultimate understanding, and that's in quotes directly from Vigan, ultimate understanding as white people, and by ultimate understanding she means our awakening, our ultimate grasping of the reality of white supremacy in our day-to-day world. How might our ultimate understanding as white people come at less of a cost, financial cost, emotional cost, physical collective cost to Black people than it usually does? I think one of the best examples of how the learning of white people comes at a cost to people of color comes from the example of white tears. You often hear people of color lament that when they reach out the kindness, when they attempt to offer education and perspective to their white counterparts, the reactivity and the feelings of the white people tend to take over the room. It's this phrase, white tears, that often when we hear about the pain that has been inflicted on communities of color for hundreds and hundreds of years, often our own emotional reaction or our own defensive reaction takes over. And we become, again, the center of the interaction, and we become unable or unwilling to listen to the perspectives of people of color. So we must first, of course, admit that we benefit from the structures of white supremacy. We talk about that a lot here at the CVUU. Just acknowledging that white supremacy exists and that as white people we have benefited from it. We also need to acknowledge and really hold very intentionally the historical reality of every interaction between white and Black people. For hundreds of years, Black people were valued never for their own inherent human worth, and we'll talk about inherent human worth in just a moment, but for the worth of their labor and how it contributed to the wealth of white people. So you hear all this defense, right, of people when, especially when the conversation about reparations comes up, and white people say, why should my tax dollars pay for something that occurred 400 years ago that I had nothing to do with, connecting to slavery? Why should I have to pay for that? Why do Black people today need reparations when slavery ended such an incredibly long time ago? What we forget in that dismissal is that every interaction between a white and a Black person or a white and a Black community comes with all of that historical perspective behind us. And so one of the ways that you can work to decenter your own perspective is by holding that truth really intentionally and consistently through any interaction you have when trying to do anti-racist work. It's our responsibility as white people to ensure that none of our behavior contributes to the upholding of our historical legacy or continues to deny or subvert the moral agency, Figgins' words, of Black people. We tend to want to predetermine the needs of people of color. We assume we know the details of their experiences, and we assume and dismiss their feelings. So, of course, a big part of this, and towards the end of this message I'll discuss this, is about self-awareness, right? Is about holding all of these things when you notice them, especially coming up in your attempts to decenter whiteness. It's all about self-awareness and holding yourself accountable to consistently doing the work. Now I'm going to talk about the necessity of reframing our theology as people of faith. And Vigen, in her essay, she writes for ethicists, and she writes for academics, and she also writes for faith leaders. And she says that we must create a new theological anthropology. Theological anthropology is a faith tradition's conceptualization of what it means to be human. Now, some of you may be thinking, and it makes sense that Unitarian Universalists may knee-jerk at this suggestion that we reframe our conceptualization of what it means to be human, because our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of all people. So we've already done that work, we might say. We already love and respect all humankind. But our tradition is connected to the Abrahamic traditions, and our tradition is connected to the wider world. We are all influenced constantly by the enculturations of whiteness. And these enculturations historically, implicitly, and explicitly considers the model of humanity to be European, white, and male. Been reading a lot lately about white feminism, and I think that this is actually this is a good way to explain how our perspectives about whiteness make its way into everything else that we do. So white feminism, there's all of this conversation about the failure of white feminists to invite true intersectionality, to actually fight for our sisters of color. And that is because Black women begin from a different orientation than their white sisters. That is that white women, well, of course, we have been believed to be lesser. We have always been understood to be human, right? There has never been a question about the inherent humanness of white women, whereas Black women arrived in this country initially as property. So that means that the starting orientation of white and Black women is fundamentally imbalanced, a fact that the majority of white feminists have not grasped, excuse me, or even yet begun to think about. So let's talk about what this theological reorientation of our understanding of what it means to be human looks like. Our frame of reference of what it means to be human should come from the most vulnerable within society. Roman Catholic womanist M. Sean Copeland, and she is remarkable. And often if you're looking for some real radical feminist writing, look to Roman Catholic women because they really, there are Roman Catholic womanist writers who are just so deeply radical in their feminism. She writes and argues that the only viable anthropological subject is the one situated among the bodies of the most despised, exploited, and disregarded. Vigen writes, the requirements of the most marginalized within a society, therefore, ought to be the normative starting point for an adequate understanding of what justice means in human relations. This idea that our theological understanding of what it means to be human be rooted in the image of the most vulnerable amongst us may seem obvious, but it blew my mind because it is not reflexive and natural for us, especially white people who are enculturated in the center of whiteness, to orient ourselves towards the most vulnerable in our society. It's not what we naturally do first. And so I want you to imagine, I want you to think about what it would be like every time we recited our first principle. Every time that we said, we are Unitarian Universalists and we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, we intentionally and consciously decentered our socialized perspective of what comprises a human being and intentionally and consciously reoriented our thinking to the world's most marginalized, despised, exploited, and disregarded. Vigan notes 4 themes in the effort of white people to become better listeners, which is essential in decentering whiteness. Those themes are inductive learning, seeking collaborators, reflexivity, and accountability. And to conclude, I'll define each of those themes, and then I'll remind us of Vigan's 3 tasks. Inductive learning. Inductive learning means approaching an encounter with zero assumption about the perspective of others in the encounter. It means abandoning our hypothesis or our tendency to assume we already know everything a person of color could attempt to teach us. Seeking collaborators. When seeking collaborators of color, we need to displace and reform our white frameworks and paradigms. This is not about inviting people of color to our table, because of course historically we own the table and we own every table. It is about waiting and being invited to their table through the demonstration of good allyship. Reflexivity. Simply reflexivity is a self-reflection and a mutual give and take between 2 parties. And lastly, accountability means intentional and consistent checking yourself against misappropriation and misinterpretation. It means flexing your ability to reflect and to be aware of your own biases, your own assumptions, whatever it is that you on your own bring to the table. It's about flexing that like a muscle and learning to do these constant checks about misinterpretation or defensiveness, so that it becomes natural, which at first is really hard. And you know, one of the things that I learned about in chaplaincy and continue to learn about today is just how my own baggage, you know, the things that I bring into the room can influence any encounter that I have. And so checking my baggage at the door and entering into a patient encounter fully empty of assumptions or of a direction in which I want that visit to go is one of the first and most difficult tasks of being a good chaplain. So we must center the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the people we wish to learn from. I'm going to say that again. We must center first the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the people of color from whom we wish to learn. Lastly, all of our collective work in decentering whiteness must contribute in some way to the positive transformation of society. To conclude, these are the 3 basic tasks. We must listen fully to the truths of communities of color who have suffered so long and so pervasively from white supremacy. 2, how do we resist our tendency to co-opt, translate, diminish, or excuse that which people of color tell us about their experiences? And finally, how might our ultimate understanding or awakening as white people come at less of a cost financial, emotional, physical collective to the Black folks with whom we wish to partner than it usually does. Our commitment as Unitarian Universalists is, of course, to uphold our inherent worth and dignity, while respecting and revering our interconnection. This is our first and our seventh principles at its strongest, and decentering whiteness is integral to the mission of our faith and the mission of living out and upholding our seven principles in the world around us. That's my message for you this morning. Amen, and blessed be.